Picture an American city at sunrise. Hundreds of armed men gather outside a military armory. Some carry rifles, others carry shotguns. Their leaders are not fugitives, foreign soldiers, or political outsiders. They are businessmen, newspaper publishers, former military officers, and some of the most influential citizens in the city. Their first target is a newspaper. It belongs to a black editor named Alexander Manley. The armed crowd marches through Wilmington, North Carolina, smashes the printing equipment, pours fuel through the building, and watches the newspaper office burn. But destroying the newspaper is only the beginning. Gunfire soon spreads through black neighborhoods. Families run into forests, cemeteries, and swamps. Black men are shot in the streets. Community leaders are placed on trains and ordered never to return. Then the armed movement turns towards City Hall. Before the day is over, members of Wilmington's lawful government will be forced from office. The attackers will choose their replacements, and one of the men who helped lead the armed crowd will become mayor. This happened in the United States, not during the American Revolution, not during the Civil War. It happened on November 10, 1898. For decades, textbooks called it a race riot, but a riot does not systematically replace a government. A coup does. And the real mystery is not simply how the coup succeeded. It is how the men responsible were allowed to rewrite the story afterward. Most Americans have never heard of the Wilmington coup. Those who encountered it in older books were often told about the Wilmington Race Riot of 1898. That description creates a familiar picture. Two racial groups become angry. Fighting begins. Public order collapses. The authorities eventually restore peace. But that is not what happened in Wilmington. The violence was not an unexpected explosion between equally powerful communities. It followed months of political organization, racial propaganda, armed intimidation, and preparation by members of North Carolina's Democratic establishment. The people leading the campaign had clear objectives. They wanted to break a multiracial political alliance. They wanted to remove black citizens from positions of authority. They wanted to regain control of Wilmington's government. And they wanted to make sure that black voters could never take that power back. The massacre was real. Black residents were killed. But the violence was also a political instrument. It created enough terror to force officials from office, drive political opponents out of town, and install a new government. Calling it only a riot hides that objective. It turns an organized seizure of power into an unfortunate outbreak of disorder. And that difference would determine how generations understood the event. To understand why Wilmington became a target, you must first understand what the city represented. In the 1890s, Wilmington was North Carolina's largest city. It was a busy port connected to railroads, cotton exports, timber products, warehouses, shipping, and international trade. It was also approximately 56% black. This was not simply a city where formerly enslaved people lived on the economic margins. Black residents worked as dock workers, carpenters, blacksmiths, brick masons, teachers, barbers, merchants, police officers, and government employees. Wilmington had black homeowners, black professionals, black businesses, black community organizations, and a small but influential black middle class. Black vendors sometimes sold goods beside white vendors in the same markets. Black workers competed for skilled jobs. Black citizens participated in politics. Some served on the city's board of aldermen and in other municipal positions. This did not make Wilmington racially equal. White residents still controlled much of the city's wealth. Segregation and racial violence remained serious threats. But Wilmington demonstrated something that many white supremacists considered dangerous. Black political freedom could produce economic independence. Economic independence could support newspapers, schools, churches, businesses, and political organizations. And those institutions could make black citizenship harder to destroy. To black residents, Wilmington showed what freedom might become. To white elites determined to restore complete racial control, it showed what had to be stopped. The political struggle extended far beyond Wilmington. For years, North Carolina Democrats had dominated the state by presenting themselves as the party of white rule. But in the 1890s, falling crop prices, debt, railroad power, and economic frustration divided white voters. Many struggling white farmers joined the Populist Party. Black voters largely supported the Republican Party, which was still associated with emancipation and Reconstruction. The Populists and Republicans did not agree on everything. Their partnership was practical rather than harmonious. But they discovered that if they stopped competing against each other, they could defeat the Democrats. This cooperation became known as fusion. Fusion candidates won control of the North Carolina legislature in 1894. They succeeded again in 1896 and helped elect Republican Daniel Russell as governor. The fusion government expanded local self-government and changed election rules. It also created opportunities for black office holders and challenged the network of Democratic politicians, newspaper owners, lawyers, and businessmen who had expected to control the state. The alliance revealed a frightening possibility for the Democratic establishment. Poor white farmers and black voters did not need to love each other. They only needed enough shared interest to vote together. That coalition could repeatedly defeat the old ruling class, so Democratic leaders needed to break it. They could have tried to win back farmers through economic policies. Instead, they made racial fear the center of the 1898 campaign. Their message was simple. A white man who voted with black Republicans was not merely changing parties. He was surrendering his community, his government, and even his family to what Democrats called Negro rule. The campaign transformed a political alliance into a racial emergency. The fight was about race. But race was also the weapon used to regain economic and political power. The campaign had different kinds of organizers. Furnifold Simmons directed the statewide Democratic strategy. Newspaper publisher Josephus Daniels used the News and Observer to spread the white supremacy message across North Carolina. Speakers such as Charles Aycock and Alfred Moore Waddell addressed white crowds. Armed groups known as Red Shirts rode through communities threatening black voters and pressuring white men to support the Democrats. In Wilmington, elite businessmen formed an organization later remembered as the Secret Nine. They divided the city into sections and developed a coordinated structure for controlling neighborhoods. These were not powerless men reacting to government oppression. They included people with access to money, newspapers, businesses, weapons, political organizations, and local militia units. Their greatest obstacle was not that black citizens controlled everything. They did not. Their problem was that black citizens controlled anything. A black police officer represented authority. A black newspaper represented an independent public voice. A black government employee represented access to wages and patronage. A multiracial board represented the possibility that political power did not have to belong exclusively to white Democrats. The campaign's organizers presented themselves as defenders of civilization, but they were defending a system in which political authority, good jobs, and public influence were expected to remain white. They did not merely want to win an election. They wanted to decide who was allowed to participate in government at all. Political intimidation required a story. The organizers needed white voters to believe that black political participation created an immediate danger. One of their most effective weapons was the claim that black men threatened white women. In 1897, Georgia activist Rebecca Felton publicly defended lynching as a response to alleged sexual attacks on white women. In August 1898, Alexander Manly responded in the Wilmington Daily Record. Manly argued that newspapers falsely presented every relationship between a black man and a white woman as an assault. He also confronted a hypocrisy that white society rarely acknowledged. White men had exploited and assaulted black women for generations while claiming to defend racial purity. His editorial was provocative. Some black leaders feared it would place the entire community in danger. Some urged him to withdraw it. But the editorial did not create the white supremacy campaign. It gave the campaign a symbol. Democratic newspapers repeatedly reprinted portions of the article beneath inflammatory headlines. Manly was presented not as one editor expressing an argument, but as evidence that black political freedom endangered every white family. The tactic worked because it transformed politics into panic. A debate over elections, jobs, taxes, and government reform became a story about protecting women from an invented racial emergency. Once voters accepted that story, intimidation could be described as self-defense, violence could be described as protection, and destroying democracy could be described as saving civilization. The newspaper was the public target. The government was the real prize. By Election Day, November 8, 1898, the campaign had moved beyond speeches. Armed white groups patrolled voting areas. Black workers risked losing their jobs if employers learned they had registered. Red shirts appeared throughout the region. Some polling places were disrupted. PBS's historical account describes armed men entering voting locations and fraudulent ballots being substituted during the confusion. The result was a sweeping Democratic victory across North Carolina. To the public, the campaign appeared to have achieved its purpose. But Wilmington presented a problem. The election did not automatically remove every member of the city's existing government. Black and white fusion supporters still occupied municipal positions. They still represented a form of political power that the white supremacy campaign had promised to eliminate. Winning the election had given Democrats control of the state, but they had not yet completely taken Wilmington. On November 9, hundreds of white men gathered at the courthouse. They adopted what they called the White Declaration of Independence. The document announced that white citizens would no longer accept government involving black political authority. It demanded that Manly's newspaper stop publishing. It also demanded that black leaders answer the ultimatum. A committee led by Alfred Waddell delivered the demands. Black representatives agreed to respond, but their written answer was not delivered by the deadline. Waddell later used that failure as justification for action. Whether the missing response was a misunderstanding, a communication failure, or a convenient excuse no longer mattered. The machinery was already in motion. They had won the election. Now they intended to take the city. On the morning of November 10th, approximately 500 armed white men gathered near the Wilmington Light Infantry Armory. Waddell led them toward the Daily Record. They were searching for Alexander Manly. But Manly had already escaped from the city. The mob broke into the newspaper office. The printing equipment was destroyed. Fire consumed the building. Black firefighters arrived to stop the flames from spreading, but armed men initially prevented them from approaching. The crowd continued to grow. By some accounts, it reached approximately 2,000 armed white men. A surviving photograph shows men and boys posing near the ruins of the newspaper building. The picture does not resemble people shocked by an unexpected tragedy. It resembles a victory photograph. Soon, violence moved into Wilmington's black neighborhoods. At an intersection in the northern part of the city, armed white men confronted a much smaller group of black residents. Witnesses disagreed about the exact first shot, but the power imbalance was unmistakable. Hundreds of armed white men, some carrying repeating rifles, faced a small number of black men attempting to protect themselves and their neighborhood. Gunfire spread. Black residents were shot while fleeing. Homes and churches were searched. The city's white militia units entered black neighborhoods while claiming they were suppressing a black uprising. But some of the militia commanders were themselves connected to the white supremacy movement. Weapons intended to maintain public order were therefore placed in the hands of men participating in the campaign. Families grabbed whatever they could carry. Some ran toward Pine Forest Cemetery. Others hid beneath houses. Some entered the surrounding forests and swamps. Parents attempted to keep children silent while gunmen moved through the streets. The violence looked chaotic at ground level, but it served a clear political function. It made resistance almost impossible. The exact number of people killed remains unknown. That uncertainty matters, but it should not be used to minimize what happened. The local coroner documented 14 deaths. Later reports suggested dozens. North Carolina's official historical summary cites the 2006 State Commission's conclusion that as many as 60 people may have been killed. Some historians believe the true number could have been higher. Incomplete records, missing bodies, frightened families, and the mass flight from the city make certainty impossible. The reported dead were black, but the number of deaths tells only part of the story. Thousands experienced terror. Approximately 2,000 people moved through the streets seeking safety during the violence, according to the PBS account. Many black residents later left Wilmington permanently. Families were separated. Businesses lost their owners. Workers lost jobs. Community leaders lost homes and property. People who had spent years accumulating savings were forced to begin again elsewhere. The damage was not limited to one burning building or one day of gunfire. A newspaper disappeared. Political networks disappeared. Businesses lost customers and leadership. Families lost property that might otherwise have passed to children and grandchildren. Fear changed where people lived, where they worked, and whether they believed they could safely participate in public life. Wilmington had been a majority black city. After the coup and the exodus, it became majority white. The objective was not simply to punish a few political opponents. It was to transform the city's population and power structure. The most famous image of the coup is the burned newspaper office. But the decisive moment occurred after the building was destroyed. Armed white leaders turned toward Wilmington's government. Members of the Board of Aldermen were pressured to resign. As seats became vacant, the remaining board selected replacements connected to the white supremacy movement. Those replacements then helped remove more officials. The process created the appearance of legal procedure. Votes were taken. Oaths were administered. Names were entered into government records. But the entire process occurred under armed coercion. Eventually, the mayor resigned. Alfred Waddell was installed in his place. The man who had threatened before the election to choke the Cape Fear with carcasses had helped lead an armed crowd through the city. Now he controlled City Hall. This is what distinguishes the Wilmington attack from an ordinary riot. The organizers did not merely influence an election. They did not simply protest officials. They used organized force to remove a lawful government and replace it with one of their choosing. A riot attacks public order. A coup captures it. The event was not decided when the newspaper burned. It was decided when armed coercion entered the machinery of government and came out wearing the appearance of law. Once the new government was installed, the campaign continued. Black political leaders and white fusion supporters were ordered to leave Wilmington. Some were escorted to the train station. Others fled before armed men reached them. Alexander Manley lost his newspaper, property, and position in the community. He eventually built a new life outside North Carolina, but Wilmington's independent black daily newspaper never returned. No organizer was meaningfully punished for overthrowing the government. No major prosecution dismantled the movement. No state or federal intervention restored the previous officials. Instead, many participants advanced. Furnifold Simmons later served for decades in the United States Senate. Josephus Daniels became Secretary of the Navy and later an ambassador. Charles Aycock became governor of North Carolina. Waddell remained mayor of Wilmington. The message was unmistakable. Political violence did not end their careers. It helped build them. The coup succeeded not only because its leaders seized City Hall. It succeeded because institutions outside Wilmington allowed the new political order to survive. The final stage of the coup was not the gunfire. It was the absence of accountability after the shooting stopped. Myths and misunderstandings. Myth 1. It was a spontaneous race riot. The violence followed a long political campaign. Organizers used newspapers, speeches, neighborhood captains, armed clubs, militia connections, and business networks. The events of November 10 were not disconnected from that preparation. They were its conclusion. Myth 2. Black residents were attempting to take over the city. Black citizens already formed a major part of Wilmington's population and economy. Some held public positions, but white residents still controlled much of the wealth and many institutions. The phrase Negro rule exaggerated black political participation to create fear. Myth 3. Alexander Manly's editorial caused the coup. The editorial became a powerful propaganda tool. But the Democratic campaign to destroy fusion and restore white political control was already underway. Without the article, organizers could have found another symbol. The cause was the struggle over power. The editorial was the weapon chosen to inflame it. Myth 4. The election resolved the conflict. Democrats won the state election under conditions involving intimidation and fraud, but the existing Wilmington government remained in place. The coup occurred because the organizers wanted more than an electoral victory. They wanted the immediate removal of officials and the permanent destruction of black political power. Myth 5. Both sides possessed equal power. One side had elite business support, statewide political organization, major newspapers, militia connections, repeating rifles, and neighborhood patrols. The other consisted largely of residents trying to survive and protect their families. Calling the event a conflict between equal racial mobs disguises the imbalance. Myth 6. The coup affected only one city. Wilmington became a demonstration of what political intimidation could achieve. The lack of punishment encouraged a broader attack on black voting rights. The city was the laboratory. The entire state experienced the consequences. Could the coup have been stopped? Possibly. The governor could have attempted stronger intervention. Federal authorities could have investigated violations of constitutional rights. National leaders could have treated the removal of Wilmington's government as an attack on American democracy rather than a local racial disturbance. But intervention would not have been simple. Some militia officers responsible for restoring order were connected to the white supremacy movement. Local information reaching the governor falsely portrayed black residents as the aggressors. Federal commitment to protecting black civil rights had collapsed after Reconstruction. The Supreme Court had already weakened federal protection against racial discrimination, and national politicians increasingly prioritized reconciliation between white Americans over the safety and citizenship of black Americans. Even direct intervention might have stopped some killings without destroying the statewide political movement behind them. The deeper problem was not that officials lacked all possible tools. It was that powerful institutions lacked the will to use them. The coup was carried out by armed men in Wilmington, but it was enabled by people far beyond Wilmington who chose inaction. The overthrow helped mark the collapse of multiracial democracy in North Carolina. In 1899, the Democratic-controlled legislature drafted a constitutional amendment designed to restrict voting. Voters approved it in 1900. The amendment used literacy requirements and a poll tax. A grandfather clause protected many white voters who might otherwise have failed the literacy requirement by exempting men whose ancestors had been eligible to vote before 1867. Because most black men had been denied voting rights before that date, the exemption overwhelmingly benefited white citizens. The effect was dramatic. PBS's historical account states that approximately 126,000 black men were registered to vote in North Carolina in 1896. By 1902, that number had fallen to roughly 600. Black political representation collapsed. The Fusion Alliance disappeared. The Democratic Party established long-term control. Segregation became more deeply embedded in law and public life. The coup also altered Wilmington economically. When black entrepreneurs, professionals, workers, and property owners fled, they carried skills and experience with them. But they could not carry every house, business, customer relationship, or community institution. Property and opportunity remained behind. The perpetrators did not merely change an election result. They redirected wealth, jobs, land, and political influence across generations. Average people often imagine democracy dying when soldiers occupy a national parliament. Wilmington shows another possibility. Democracy can be destroyed locally. It can be destroyed by controlling polling places, newspapers, employment, police power, and public memory. And if the result is allowed to stand, a local seizure of power can reshape an entire state. After the takeover, many white newspapers described black residents as the aggressors. Headlines portrayed armed white men as protectors restoring law and order. The people who planned the campaign were therefore transformed into reluctant defenders. The people who were attacked became the supposed source of the danger. The word riot helped complete that transformation. A riot appears spontaneous. A coup requires planning. A riot suggests disorder rising from below. A coup directs attention toward leaders, institutions, weapons, political objectives, and the transfer of power. Calling Wilmington a riot encouraged readers to ask, why did the black population become violent? Calling it a coup forces a different question. Who organized the removal of the government? For decades, versions of the story repeated the language of the perpetrators. Some textbooks described the event vaguely. Others treated it as an unfortunate racial conflict. The political planning disappeared from view. The imbalance of power became blurred. The city government's removal became a minor detail. This was not total erasure. Records survived. Black newspapers challenged the official narrative. Witnesses wrote accounts. Families preserved memories. Photographs remained. But the dominant public story changed what those records appeared to mean. The event was not forgotten because no evidence existed. It was forgotten because the people who seized power also gained the authority to name what they had done. Wilmington forces us to reconsider what a coup looks like. There was no foreign army. There was no attack on Washington. There was no single national dictator announcing a new regime. There were local businessmen, political operatives, newspaper editors, armed organizations, militia officers, and ordinary citizens persuaded that democracy had become dangerous because the wrong people were using it. The organizers did not reject elections entirely. They used elections when elections helped them. They used fraud when fraud helped them. They used propaganda to define their opponents as illegitimate. And when the existing government survived, they used armed force. Afterward, they returned to legal language and official procedure. That combination made the takeover durable. Violence opened the door. Law and public memory kept it open. The lesson is not that every political disagreement will become Wilmington. History does not repeat itself with identical characters and weapons. The lesson is that democracy depends on more than ballots. It depends on whether citizens accept the political rights of people they fear or dislike. It depends on whether newspapers expose propaganda or manufacture it. It depends on whether police and military institutions serve the law or a political movement. It depends on whether leaders who use violence are punished or rewarded. And it depends on whether later generations are willing to call an event by its correct name. Wilmington was a massacre. It was an act of racial terror. And it was a coup. Revelation. Return to the photograph of the burned newspaper office. Look beyond the smoke. Look beyond the armed men posing near the ruins. The building mattered because it contained more than a printing press. It contained an independent black voice. It connected businesses with customers. It connected voters with political arguments. It recorded births, deaths, achievements, injustices, and community life. Destroying the Daily Record attacked the community's ability to describe itself. Taking City Hall attacked its ability to govern itself. Driving its leaders away attacked its ability to rebuild. And calling the entire operation a riot attacked the ability of future generations to understand it. At first, Wilmington appears to be a story about racial violence in one southern city. But when you follow the newspapers, weapons, business interests, political organizations, and forced resignations, it becomes something larger. It becomes a story about how democracy can be dismantled while its destroyers claim they are restoring order. The Wilmington coup was not hidden because nothing was recorded. It was hidden because the men who took the city also took control of the story. They did not erase all the evidence. They changed what America was told the evidence meant.